Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to this session. I have to really thank Professor Hausner and the organizer of these impressive events for having me here. What's the purpose today is to give you the flavor of the economic debate, both from a theoretical and an empirical point of view, about the issues of this afternoon, that is the relationship between machines and human beings. The painting you see in the slides was actually painted by Fernand Léger 100 years ago, 1917. And the interesting point is that robots are playing cards. So even 100 years ago, people were actually concerned about the possibility of robots to substitute human beings, even in cognitive skills, like playing cards. That is a complex activity. And this is exactly the today alarm. And the self-driving Google or Tesla car is an example of this kind of concern. The new technological revolution is actually coming out, the so-called Industry 4.0. And again, the fear of technology unemployment is spread around. In an influential book, two American scholars, Byron Johnson and McAfee, actually tried to explain that the employment problems we are facing nowadays are not connected so much with the Great Recession, but with the Great Restructuring. And this new technological revolution is coming out. And this is not only jobless growth in perspective, but the impact is a so-called ever bigger impact on job skills and the world economy. I mean, this kind of revolution seems to be different from the past. And the point is exactly what I mentioned before, that not only manual skill, but cognitive skill are at risk. And according to some studies, like the one by Fred Osborne recently published, in Technological Forecasting and Social Change, almost 50% of jobs are at risk. And this was also the figure that was discussed by Dr. Potoknik just at the end of the morning section. Now, on the one hand, workers from the beginning, from the very first industrial revolution in Manchester and Lancashire, when the textile machinery they were actually introduced, the answer was to destroy machinery. All of us remember about the Luddite. Ned Ludd was actually the boss of this riot against the machine, this kind of rage against the machinery in the Lancashire, while Captain Swing in the south of England did the same against the threshing machinery. The biggest scandals came out when one of the most influential economists of that time, David Ricardo, that is represented in the figure, that was, by the way, also a policymaker. David Ricardo was an economist, was also a member of parliament in London. And he came out with a conclusion that actually this kind of reaction by the workers were not completely out of the principle of economics, but in a way consistent to the correct principle of political economy. This kind of pessimistic attitude by David Ricardo has been a little bit overemphasized. If you go through the chapters written by Ricardo, you realize that Ricardo was actually an optimist. Only in an exceptional case, when technological changes brought about substitution of workers, but is not bringing about any increase in output, you can have technological unemployment. Otherwise, in most cases, what is likely is a kind of compensation of the initial job losses. This is the core of the economic thinking that we will see in a nutshell, because time is actually short, in order to give you again the flavor of this debate. This debate was a classical debate opposing Jean-Baptiste Say, for instance, and Karl Marx on the other sides. Here you have different quotations. We don't have time to go into details, but I will try to give you a kind of summary of the theory. This is John Hicks, and is one of the most influential economists of the neoclassical thinking, the mainstream economic thinking, and the theory is still there. I mean, nowadays, if you talk with a mainstream economist talking about the possible impact of technology on jobs, is a theoretical economist is giving you this kind of picture that we will see a little bit in detail now. So, first, process innovation. Process innovation, by definition, for an economist, they have a direct labor-saving effect. Because for an economist, technological change is a shifting of the production function. That means the possibility to get the same output with less input, less capital, less labor. So technological employment is the first effect. But we don't have to worry too much, because there are market compensation mechanisms that then counterbalance, or even more than counterbalance, this initial effect. First one. Okay, you have robots that can actually displace labor downstreams, but you need the labor to build up, to construct, to produce robots and new machinery. So what you lose downstream, you can get upstream. Second, more powerful compensation mechanism. If you have a perfect competition, that means very, very flexible market competition and a tendency for prices to go down. When you have a technological change, you introduce technological change because it's profitable. It's actually giving you a decrease in average cost. For instance, because you don't have to pay the workers that actually are displaced. So average costs are going down. If we are in a perfect competition situation, prices are going down. And if prices are going down, demand is going up, production is going up. And then you are again people. So you have a compensation via decreasing prices, increasing demand and production. If by chance, as is in the reality, you are not in a perfect competition environment, because you have some rigidity, you have some monopoly, or even some oligopolistic situation, that is the more common situation, not all the gains of technological change are going to the consumers. Not all the gains going into decreasing prices and to the benefit of the consumers. But some are retained by the entrepreneurs in terms of higher profits. Well, no problem. Higher profits will be converted in higher investments, higher demand, higher production, and higher employment. So either decreasing prices or increasing investments, at the end of the day, you can counterbalance the initial job losses effect. If some kind of unemployment is still there, you can rely on the usual mechanism in the labor market. Increasing unemployment means decreasing wages. Decreasing real wages make possible the hiring of new people, because labor is cheaper and so is hired. So very, very optimistic view, and that's what you find in most of theoretical articles and debate among economists, at least among the mainstream economists. Of course, this is very, very abstract kind and very, very simplified word. Chris Freeman, that was one of the master of the economics of innovation, was actually very critical about this very, very optimistic view brought about by the economists. For economists, is saying technological change may just result in some temporary unemployment, but then with market working efficiently, there is no basic economic problem, and at the end of the day, you still have full employment. This is really too optimistic because there are very, very critical steps. And this is John Maynard Keynes, that, as you know, was one of the main critical of the mainstream economists. And by chance, he also wrote a letter to our grandchildren debating and discussing the challenge of the machinery in terms of technological employment. Problems in the different mechanisms. First of all, new machinery. Well, new machinery at best can compensate a very, very little portion of technological employment. Why? First of all, in order to be profitable, they have to get rid of a number of people that has to be higher of the people that you have to need for producing them. Otherwise, the system is not profitable. Second, process innovation is within the capital goods sector as well. So now machinery and robots are produced with much less workers than in the past. So it's a kind of chicken and egg problem. But on top of that, most of technological change embodied in new machinery investments is not embodied in additional investments. It's just a substitution. What we do when a computer is obsolete, we substitute it. When we do an assembly line that is electromechanical has to be digitalized, is just to substitute the assembly line. So if you have this kind of substitution, you don't have any kind of compensation in capital goods sectors. Because in capital goods sectors, you stop to build up the old machinery and you produce the new one, probably with less workers than before. So this kind of mechanism is very, very, very weak. What about the decreasing prices? Well, first of all, if you have some technological employment, demand is going down because people with no jobs, they don't have any income. And so you have a collapse in the purchasing power. So the very first effect is a decrease in demand, not an increase in demand. And the discussion we will have about the basic income is correctly discussing this point. Second, the prices going down is not sufficient to increase demand. It depends on the price elasticity, what we call price elasticity. Sometimes price goes down 100%, your demand is increasing 50% or 30% or 20%. It depends on the different sectors. Finally, decreasing prices are not sufficient to get increasing demand. For instance, if you think about investments, you don't decreasing interest rates and decreasing prices is not enough. And you see the situation in Europe today. Very, very, very small and weak recovery. Even if we have the quantitative easing, decreasing prices of machinery and decreasing interest rates. Why? Because the expectation, they are not optimistic. So even when you have prices going down, you can stop buying and delay your purchasing. And that's particularly true when we talk about investments. To have profits is a necessary but not a sufficient condition to invest. To invest, you need to have good expectation about the future, about selling your products. So again, this is a very, very optimistic view. Having said that, we have to remind that we were just talking about process innovation. But technological change is also product innovation. And in this case, you don't have a job losses effect. You have a job creation effect. So at the end of the day, the economic theory is not giving an answer, a clear answer. And what you need is empirical studies. A good guidelines for empirical studies is given by Schumpeter and the distinction in between process and product innovation. And here what you have the innovation input that you can actually measure and estimate in an econometric exercise, and we'll do some brief summary in a few minutes. You have R&D as an investment in innovation, but this is just 50% of what business firm they do. The rest is embodied technological change. Embodied technological change is exactly the implementation of new machinery, robots, and so on. R&D are more directly connected with product innovation, and product innovation, as we mentioned, has a job creation effect. While embodied technological change, that what we discussed so far, is more connected with process innovation and job destruction. Of course, you have interlinks, and you have a kind of gray area here, so the things is complicated from an empirical point of view, but it's work to do. It's work to do because, again, if we have a critical aptitude about economic theory, we cannot assume ex ante that we will have compensation and full employment at the end. We have to test, we have to look at data, we have to look at empirical evidence. Previous empirical evidence, including some works of mine, is generally optimistic, especially when you look at the microeconometric studies, looking at the longitudinal data at the firm level. What you find is a positive effect of innovation on employment. And this, in a way, is a good news. Overall, there seems to be a positive impact at the end of the day of innovation. On the positive sides, putting together the literature and my key findings in some recent works I tried to deliver, and try to take into account not only R&D but also embodied technological change. One of the critical point of the previous study is that most of them are actually using R&D, and R&D, as we said before, is more connected with product innovation and job creation. So there's a kind of optimistic bias in the data. If you take into account embodied technological change, the story is slightly different. Anyway, on the positive side of the coin, good. R&D is labor friendly. In terms of policy, this is consistent with the European policy. The target of R&D over GDP all over Europe above 3% is good for employment. We don't have to scare about the possible technological unemployment connected with innovation that we foster through R&D subsidies and R&D supports. R&D as such has a positive impact. But this is related to product innovation. So we need for targeted industrial policies. We don't need to give R&D subsidies to everybody. We have to focus on those firms and those sectors, the emerging sectors where demand is increasing, where new products are actually delivered. And so there's need for a selective industrial policy at the European national level. Price and income compensation mechanisms, as we described before, they work, but they can also have problems. So, for instance, a competition policy, try to create perfect competition, is also good for employment because it's actually enforcing the price mechanism we just discussed. Industrial and innovation policy is also important because this kind of positive effect is actually concentrated in high tech. And these are the negative side of the coin, the more critical one. First of all, the impact is very, very small. If you double your R&D investments, 100% increase, you have an increase in employment of 0.5%. This kind of job creation impact of R&D and product innovation is concentrated in high-tech sectors. So again, you have to be selective. You don't have to expect an increase in employment everywhere. And particularly, there are some kind of areas like traditional sectors and SMEs that are particularly vulnerable and could be affected by technological unemployment. So the policy has to be detailed and selective, because you have an area where you have good employment impact, but other areas where you can have technological employment and you need education, safety nets, and this kind of education and labor policy. These are some references, and this is just to thank you.